In a shocking twist of injustice, a so-called Karen teacher took a black girl's lunch every day, until one day, her mum packed something in her backpack that changed everything. The howling wind slammed against the lighthouse windows as Jessica's trembling hands worked to adjust the massive lamp. Outside, the storm raged with unholy fury, churning the sea into violent peaks that crashed against the rocky shore. But it wasn't the storm that made her heart race. It was the boat she could just barely make out through the torrential rain, its lone figure desperately fighting the waves. "Please, not again," she whispered, her voice lost in the howl of wind. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the autumn chill. The Coast Guard wouldn't come in this weather. She'd already tried calling twice. The radio crackled with static, occasionally punctuated by garbled fragments of emergency broadcasts. The high-D boat lurched sideways, nearly capsizing. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. Without thinking, she grabbed her rain slicker from its hook and rushed down the spiral staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. The old lighthouse keeper's cottage connected to the tower by a short, covered walkway. As she burst through the door, the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Rain struck her face like tiny needles as she struggled toward the small boathouse. "You can't go out there," came a gruff voice behind her. Mr. Patterson stood in the doorway of the cottage, his weathered face grave beneath his silver hair. His eyes, the deep blue of the ocean on clear days, were sharp with warning. "I have to," she shouted over the wind. "There's someone out there." "The sea will take what it wants," he replied, an edge of finality in his voice. "You know that. Better than anyone." Jessica turned away from him, yanking open the boathouse door. "Not this time," she muttered. The rescue boat was small but sturdy, designed for rough waters. She'd never taken it out alone before, had only assisted Mr. Patterson on calmer days. But there was no time to argue, no time to think about what had happened 3 years ago on a night just like this one. As she untied the mooring rope with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. Another message from Dr. Fletcher, no doubt, checking if she'd taken her medication today, reminding her about their upcoming session where they'd discuss her progress. The engine roared to life on the second try. Mr. Patterson appeared at the boathouse door, his expression a mixture of anger and fear. He shouted something, but his words were lost to the storm as Jessica guided the boat out into the churning waters, her eyes fixed on the distant figure still desperately clinging to their vessel. She knew it was madness. She knew the odds. But as the waves lifted her small rescue boat and slammed it back down again, all she could think was, "Not this time. I won't fail this time." 3 years earlier, Jessica Miller had been a respected marine biologist specializing in cetacean communication. At 35, she'd built a solid reputation at the university and published 2 well-received papers on dolphin vocalization patterns. Her work required long hours on the water, which suited her perfectly. She'd always felt more at home on the sea than on land. "You're crazy to go out in this weather," her research partner Emily had said that fateful morning, eyeing the gathering storm clouds. The Weather Service had issued small craft advisories, but Jessica was determined to gather more data before the season ended. "We'll be fine," she'd insisted. "I've been watching the radar. We'll have a 3-hour window before it gets bad. Besides, I've got some new hydrophone settings I want to test." Emily had reluctantly agreed, as she usually did. That was their dynamic. Jessica pushed, and Emily followed, albeit with caution. Their friendship had evolved that way since graduate school, comfortable in its predictability. They'd been out for barely 2 hours when the storm hit, much earlier than predicted. The wind shifted suddenly, and the moderately choppy waters transformed into threatening swells within minutes. "We need to head back," Emily shouted over the intensifying wind. "Just 5 more minutes," Jessica had replied, eyes fixed on her. "Equipment. I'm getting some interesting clicks here. Could be a new vocalization pattern." That decision, those 5 minutes, would haunt her forever. The wave that hit them came from nowhere, a rogue wall of water that struck their small research vessel broadside. Jessica remembered the sensation of flying, then the shocking cold of the water. Her life vest inflated automatically, bringing her back to the surface where she gasped for air among the whitecaps. "Emily!" she screamed, spinning around frantically. "Emily!" She spotted her about 20 yards away, struggling to stay afloat. Her life vest hadn't inflated properly. Jessica could see her fighting to keep her head above water. Jessica struck out toward her, swimming with all her strength against the punishing current. She was only a few yards away when Emily went under. Jessica's fingers grazed her outstretched hand before she disappeared beneath the churning surface. The Coast Guard found her 2 hours later, hypothermic and delirious, still calling Emily's name as she clung to a piece of their shattered boat. Emily's body washed ashore 3 days later. The university conducted an investigation that cleared Jessica of negligence, technically. The report cited unfortunate weather circumstances and equipment malfunction as contributing factors, but everyone knew. She had pushed to go out when they shouldn't have. She had stayed longer than was safe. The whispers followed her through the halls. The panic attack started soon after, then the nightmares, then the complete inability to set foot on a boat without hyperventilating. Her research stalled, her funding dried up, her colleagues stopped making eye contact in the hallways. 6 months after the accident, she took a medical leave of absence. A year later, she resigned her position entirely. It was Mr. Patterson, her mother's cousin and her only living relative, who had offered her a place to recover. The ancient lighthouse he maintained as part of a historical preservation program was remote enough that she wouldn't have to face people, yet the ocean remained constantly in view, a form of exposure therapy she hadn't asked for but perhaps needed. "The sea gives and the sea takes," Mr. Patterson had told her the day she arrived, his voice matter-of-fact but not unkind. "Best you make peace with that." For 2 years, she'd tried. She helped Mr. Patterson with the lighthouse maintenance. She transcribed old logs for the Historical Society. She took her medication. She spoke weekly with Dr. Fletcher via video calls. She watched the sea from a distance, never venturing onto it. Until tonight. The rescue boat slammed down hard, after cresting a massive wave, sending a jolt of pain up Jessica's spine. She gripped the wheel tighter, fighting to maintain course toward the struggling vessel now less than 50 yards away. The rain was relentless, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of her. As she drew closer, she could make out the figure more clearly. A woman in her 30s, desperately trying to bail water from a small sailboat that was clearly taking on more than she could handle. Her life jacket was a splash of orange against the grey backdrop of storm. "Hey!" Jessica shouted, pulling alongside. "You need to abandon ship! Take my hand!" The woman looked up, her face a mask of terror and exhaustion. She seemed frozen in place. "Now!" Jessica screamed, reaching as far as she dared over the side of her boat. Something in her voice must have broken through the woman's panic. She lurched toward Jessica, arms outstretched, their hands connected, her icy fingers closing around Jessica's wrist with desperate strength. With one powerful heave, Jessica pulled her over the side of the rescue boat just as another wave crashed over them. The woman collapsed to the floor, coughing and gasping. Jessica didn't waste time on pleasantries. She spun the wheel, turning the boat back toward the lighthouse, which was now barely visible through the sheeting rain. "You're crazy," the woman sputtered when she finally caught her breath, raising her voice to be heard over the storm. "Completely insane, but thank you." Jessica didn't respond. All her focus was on navigating the treacherous waters. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her vision occasionally tunneled, warning signs of an impending panic attack. She forced herself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale and exhale as Dr. Fletcher had taught her. "Not now. I can fall apart later." The return journey seemed to take an eternity. By the time the boathouse came into view, Jessica's arms ached from fighting the wheel, and her clothes were soaked through despite the rain slicker. As she carefully guided the boat into the relative shelter of the small structure, Mr. Patterson was waiting, his face a study in conflicting emotions. He secured the boat without a word, then helped the stranger to her feet. "Let's get you both inside," he said gruffly, supporting the half-drowned woman with one strong arm. In the warmth of the keeper's cottage, wrapped in dry blankets with mugs of hot tea in hand, proper introductions were finally made. Karen Reynolds, said the stranger, her voice still rough from swallowing seawater. She was tall and lean, with disheveled blonde hair in a stylish shortcut that was now plastered to her head. Her expression was one of shell-shocked gratitude. I was trying to make it to Port Henley before the storm hit. You're about 10 miles off course, Mr. Patterson observed, stoking the fire in the old stone hearth. Karen grimaced. GPS failed, then the engine. Thought I could manage with just the sail, but... She trailed off, then turned to Jessica. You saved my life. Thank you. Jessica stared into her mug, unable to meet her gaze. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the reality of what she'd done was setting in. She'd gone out on the water alone in a storm. After 3 years of being unable to even look at a boat without having a panic attack. Don't thank me yet, she said quietly. The Coast Guard will have to come for you tomorrow. You're stuck here for the night. I can think of worse places. Had to be stranded, Karen replied, attempting a smile that quickly fell away when Jessica didn't return it. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. I'll make up the spare room, he said, disappearing down the hallway. Left alone with the stranger she'd rescued, Jessica felt oddly exposed. She could feel Karen studying her, and it made her skin prickle uncomfortably. So you're the lighthouse keeper? Karen asked. Mr. Patterson is, Jessica replied. I just help out. You're pretty skilled with that rescue boat for someone who just helps out. Something in her tone made Jessica look up. There was no judgment in Karen's expression, just genuine curiosity. I used to be good on the water, Jessica said after a moment, a long time ago. Karen nodded slowly, seeming to sense the weight behind her words. Well, I'm glad you still remember how, she said simply. Later that night, after Karen had been settled in the spare room and Mr. Patterson had finally stopped giving her concerned looks, Jessica sat alone by the fire. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside her mind a different kind of storm was brewing. She'd gone out on the water, she'd faced her fear, and she'd saved someone. But she couldn't shake the feeling that in doing so, she'd betrayed Emily's memory somehow. As if by moving forward, she was leaving her behind. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Fletcher. Heard about the rescue from emergency services. Are you okay? Call me when you can. Jessica set the phone aside without responding. How? Could she explain what she barely understood herself? Outside, the lighthouse beam swept across the angry sea, a steady rhythm in the chaos of the storm. Warning, guiding, constant. Jessica closed her eyes and listened to the wind, wondering if somewhere in its howl was the answer she'd been seeking for 3 long years. The next morning broke clear and calm, as if the previous night's storm had been merely a bad dream. Jessica found Karen on the lighthouse balcony, staring out at the horizon where the blue sky met the even bluer sea. The Coast Guard called, Jessica said, keeping her distance. They'll be here in about an hour. Karen nodded without turning. Around. I spoke with them. They found what's left of my boat washed up on the rocks about a mile south. I'm sorry. She shrugged. Just a boat. Can be replaced. Now she turned to face Jessica, her eyes serious. You took quite a risk last night. Jessica looked away, focusing on a distant gull wheeling over the water. Anyone would have done the same. No, Karen said firmly. They wouldn't have. Mr. Patterson told me no one's gone out in weather like that since... She hesitated. Since the accident. A cold knot formed in Jessica's stomach. He shouldn't have told you that. Maybe not, but I'm glad he did. Karen took a step toward her. I know what it's like to be afraid of something that used to bring you joy. To avoid it at all costs, even when that avoidance becomes its own kind of prison. Jessica's eyes snapped to her face. You don't know anything about me. I know you're Dr. Jessica Miller, former marine biologist specializing in cetacean communication. I know you lost your research partner in a storm 3 years ago, and you haven't been on the water since. Until last night. She paused. I do my homework when someone saves my life. Congratulations on your Google skills, Jessica said coldly. Turning to leave. I'm a psychologist specializing in PTSD and survivor's guilt, Karen continued. stopping her in her tracks. Or I was until 2 years ago, when I lost a patient to suicide and couldn't bring myself to see another client. Now I write self-help books I don't believe in and avoid the work that once gave my life meaning. Jessica turned back slowly. Why? Are you telling me this? Because last night you faced your greatest fear to save a stranger, and I'm wondering if there might be a lesson in that for both of us. Before she could respond, Mr. Patterson called from below that the Coast Guard boat was approaching. Karen held her gaze for a moment longer, then handed her a business card. If you ever want to talk, not as a patient, just as someone who might understand a little of what you're going through, I'm usually at that address. Jessica took the card automatically. It listed an address in Port Henley, about an hour's drive down the coast. I won't call, she said. Karen smiled for the first time since Jessica had pulled her from the water. I believe you. But 3 weeks later, after another session with Dr. Fletcher that left her feeling hollow and misunderstood, Jessica found herself driving to Port Henley with Karen's card on the passenger seat beside her. The address turned out to be a small coffee shop overlooking the harbor. Karen was seated at a corner table typing on a laptop. She looked up as if sensing Jessica's presence and didn't seem the least bit surprised to see her. You didn't believe me, Jessica said, sliding into the chair across from her. No, Karen admitted, but I hoped. Over the next few months, they fell into a routine. Once a week, Jessica would drive to Port Henley and they would talk, not as therapist and patient, but as two people trying to make sense of their broken pieces. Karen spoke of her patient, a young veteran who had seemed to be improving until the day he wasn't. Jessica shared more about Emily, about their friendship that had spanned a decade, about the guilt that still consumed her. You know what the hardest part is? She said one rainy afternoon, watching boats bob in the harbor through the coffee shop window. Everyone says it wasn't my fault. The investigation cleared me. Dr. Fletcher says I need to forgive myself. But they don't understand. What don't they understand? Karen asked quietly. That I don't want forgiveness, Jessica whispered. I want to go back and make a different choice. And since I can't do that, the guilt is all I have left of her. If I let it go, it's like losing Emily all over again. Karen was silent for a long moment. What do you think Emily would say about that? The question hit Jessica like a physical blow, because of course, she knew exactly what Emily would say. She'd say Jessica was being ridiculous. She'd tell her to get back on the water, to continue their research, to live the life she no longer could. She'd hate seeing me like this, Jessica admitted, her voice barely audible. Then maybe the way to honor her isn't by punishing yourself, Karen suggested gently. Maybe it's by finding your way back to what you loved, what you both loved. That night, Jessica stood on the lighthouse balcony, watching the beam sweep across the calm waters. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to remember not just the tragic end, but the joy that had come before, the exhilaration of discovery, the peace of being on the water, the purpose she'd once felt in her work. The next morning, she called the university. Spring came to the coast, bringing with it longer days and gentler seas. Jessica stood on the dock behind the lighthouse keeper's cottage, staring at the small research vessel she'd purchased with what remained of her savings. The name painted on the stern, Emily's Echo, gleamed in the morning sunlight. You sure about this? Mr. Patterson asked, coming to stand beside her. Over the months, he'd witnessed her gradual return to the woman she'd once been, or perhaps not the same woman, but one who carried her scars with a new kind of dignity. No, Jessica admitted, but I'm doing it anyway. Mr. Patterson nodded, respect evident in his weathered face. The best kind of courage. Karen arrived 30 minutes later, carrying equipment from the university where Jessica had been granted a provisional research position. Their friendship had deepened over the winter months, evolving into something neither of them had expected, but both welcomed cautiously, afraid to disturb its delicate balance with hasty definitions. The department head sends his regards, Karen said, loading the last of the hydrophones onto the boat. and Mrs. Carter from administration asks for regular updates. Jessica nodded, focused on checking the boat's systems. This first expedition would be short, just a few hours to test equipment and gather preliminary data on the pod of dolphins that had recently been spotted in the area. "Ready?" Karen asked when everything was secured. Jessica took a deep breath, feeling the familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest, but beneath it was something else, a quiet determination, a sense of rightness. She cast a glance toward the lighthouse, its white tower standing tall against the blue sky, then back to the open water that had been both her greatest love and her greatest fear. "Ready," she confirmed, starting the engine. As they pulled away from the dock, Jessica felt a weight lift from her shoulders, not completely gone, perhaps it never would be, but lighter, manageable. The sea stretched before them, vast and beautiful and sometimes dangerous, but always worth the journey. Behind them, the lighthouse stood guard, its beam no longer needed in the bright light of day, but ready to guide the way home when darkness fell. And somewhere, she wanted to believe, Emily was watching, approving, finally at peace, just as Jessica was learning to be.